With the success of Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, the powers that be at Paramount made the unprecedented decision to make a fourth film for the Star Trek franchise, going against what all logic and research were telling them about the viability of success when it came to sequels. And so, almost immediately after the release of Star Trek III, Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home went into full production. Hello and welcome to Backtrek, a web series that focuses on the background information of any given topic in Star Trek. In this, the continuation of our look into Star Trek's history, we'll be taking a look at the making of Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. I hope you enjoy. Paramount itself had some major shakeups right after the release of Star Trek III. Namely, both Barry Diller and Michael Eisner, along with other Paramount bigwigs, had left the studio. And so, even though Star Trek's return was virtually assured, the form that these new films would take was unclear. No one knew how these new powers that be would see Star Trek and Star Trek's future. Martin Davis became the new head of Paramount, while Frank Mancuso took over as chairman of the Paramount board. The new president of Paramount's production was Don Steele. The first thing these new powers that be decided to do was to once again put the dream team of Harve Bennett and Leonard Nimoy back into their respective positions of producer and director for this fourth installment. Sitting down in brainstorming sessions, trying to come up with the story for Star Trek IV, both men immediately agreed that this film would be different. They realized the previous films had been very dark with heavy themes. Thinking about Star Trek the original series, one of the things that hadn't been done yet was a light-hearted, comediatic film, along the lines of Star Trek's greatest and most popular episode, The Trouble with Tribbles. And so this film wouldn't have deaths, phaser fights, explosions coming out of every orifice, or an over-the-top villain. Instead, this film would be intelligent, enlightening, funny, but with a true Star Trek message to it. Well, the two men definitely had a starting point. After saving their dead, now risen Spock Jesus, the crew of the late Starship Enterprise had some pretty big problems to deal with. First, they really had no starship. Running around in a Klingon bird of prey didn't seem like the right answer for respectable Starfleet heroes. And then there was the matter of Kirk and company stealing the Enterprise. Surely Starfleet couldn't just overlook this fact. And then, of course, there was Spock. Was he the same Spock the audience knew and remembered? Or was this whole replace a Katra thing to have changed him completely? Well, eventually the two men decided on a time travel story. I mean, what else is more fun than watching our heroes interact with our present day? And of course, time travel stories were a definite staple of Star Trek. And because this film would be shot on basically normal everyday streets, it even meant that the film could save a lot of money, as new starship and space locales would not really be needed. Once again, however, and I do get tired of saying this, Gene Roddenberry would be a constant thorn in these two men's side. Roddenberry was actually over the Vulcan moon, as it were, when he was told that it would be a time travel story, one with a heart-filled message. Sending out memos to all involved in the film, he stated, "Great, time travel, now that's more like it, more like Star Trek." And of course, this was immediately followed up by, but an even better story would be to have the crew head back to the 1960s and have Spock be responsible for shooting JFK. Yep, that's right, Roddenberry was still on about his JFK storyline. The man simply would never let that one go. But again, everyone just ignored Roddenberry and went on about their business. But what reason could there be to have the crew head back in time in a stolen Klingon bird of prey? At around this time, Leonard Nimoy had become obsessed with the book Biophilia, written by Edward Wilson. This book was about how, by the end of the 20th century, thousands of animal species would have become extinct, some even before being discovered, and Wilson pondered the ramification of these losses and how that could have impacted the human race. And with this book fresh in his mind, Nimoy came up with the idea that humpback whales, a truly breathtaking and majestic species, would be extinct by the 23rd century. And this extinction would have direct, catastrophic consequences for the people of Earth. And so, Kirk and company, in a bid to save humanity, would go back in time, ending up in the mid-1980s, to grab a pair of humpback whales and bring them forward in time to save humanity from its own short-sightedness. The story idea was brilliant. It took Nimoy and Bennett only a day to come up with a rough story premise, a premise that would virtually remain unchanged throughout the entire writing process. Leonard focused all his attention on the story for the movie. He wanted the movie to have two distinctive and separate feelings, and in order to achieve this, he would ask his now good friend Nick Meyer, the writer and director of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, to help write The Voyage Home. Breaking the story into space and time travel points, Bennett would be in charge of writing all the 23rd century story elements, while Meyer would write all the scenes for the 20th century Earth. And indeed, this strategy proved successful. The character of Dr. Taylor was originally to be a male character who was a wacky college professor who was also a UFO nut. And for added humor to this lighthearted script, actor Eddie Murphy was offered the role. Murphy was a Star Trek fan and really wanted to do the project, but later he decided to appear in The Golden Child instead, a decision he admits later on that was a big mistake. And so Catherine Hicks won the role, and it was rewritten for her specifically. Every character would have his or her moment to shine in this movie. Unfortunately, however, there was one scene which they had attempted to shoot, but that ultimately failed, and so it never made it into the movie. Sulu was supposed to run into a young child on the streets of San Francisco, who was actually his distant ancestor. When it came time to film the scene, however, the child that they hired to play the role of Sulu's great-great-great-grandfather simply was not up to the task of fulfilling the role. They simply could not get him to do anything, and as a result, the scene could not be filmed and had to be cut from the movie. Early drafts of the script would also have Saavik remaining on Vulcan due to her being pregnant with Spock's child, following that steamy finger love scene from Star Trek III. This, of course, was removed from Star Trek IV, as no one wanted the censors and the audience to be asking if it was really appropriate for Saavik to have slept with such a young Vulcan, getting herself pregnant with his child. The scenes, which were filmed on board the nuclear vessel Enterprise, were actually filmed on board the USS Ranger, the Enterprise herself being out at sea at the time of filming. However, even if she had been in port, filming would not have been allowed to take place, as at the time, the ship itself was highly classified due to its nuclear arsenal. And this film would mark the last appearance of Majel Barrett as Dr. Christine Chapel. As the script took shape, Roddenberry would continue to send memo after memo, pages upon pages of his thoughts and feelings. Now, I've often said Roddenberry was ignored, but I think I should clarify this point here just a little. Most of Gene's suggestions and ideas were ignored in the sense that nobody cared or followed them. But sometimes he would actually provide helpful suggestions. And so, what Bennett would do, since he was in charge of responding to Roddenberry's memos, was simply take all the positive elements that he felt were correct and ignore the rest. Since Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, Roddenberry's major suggestions had never seen the light of day, but some of his minor ones, such as a change in dialogue here or there, did in fact make it into the scripts. However, Roddenberry truly had no power over anything. Any suggestions used were simply to make the script better as a courtesy rather than a directive, no matter what some fans may think. The Bird of Prey's bridge would also get an overhaul for this film. I asked Mike Okuda why this change had been made. As he recalls, the Star Trek III set was very simple with very little detail. There was a lot more filming in Star Trek IV on that set, so Leonard Nimoy wanted a more complete set with more detailing, as well as a better set design in terms of removable walls and such. Though the film's script was excellent and ready to be shot, there was one problem, however. how to film two of the main characters, George and Gracie. Debating their options, finding two whales out in the wild, or heading to a zoo to film the gigantic mammals, Nimoy and Bennett settled on the guys from Industrial Light and Magic, which had once again been hired on to do the special effects to bring these creatures to life. And ILM would deliver the special effects in spades, creating mechanical whales so lifelike that most fans don't even realize that they are mechanical. Scouring the maps on the Paramount lot, it was discovered that one of the paved parking lots actually held a huge water tank underneath it. And so, unpaving and restoring the tank to functioning status, suddenly the whales, the Klingon bird of prey, and the crew of the late Starship Enterprise could be smack dab in the middle of the ocean without any real danger to the actors and much better control over the environment, speeding up production on those scenes and saving the movie's budget over $1 million. Mike Okuda would also begin his almost 20 years involvement with Star Trek, starting with this movie. For this film, he designed the computer displays as well as introducing the touchscreen computer consoles, which would continue on in the rest of the Star Trek films and television shows, except of course with Star Trek Enterprise. And a bit of Trek trivia for you, at times in this film, scenes would actually be improvised. For example, the scene where Chekhov was asking about the nuclear vessels, Walter was actually asking real people on the streets of San Francisco. The scene worked so well and was so funny, not only would it be included in the film, but it would become one of the classic highlights of Star Trek in its entirety. And in honor of their tragic losses, this film would be dedicated to the men and women of the Spaceship Challenger, which unfortunately had exploded shortly after liftoff on January 28, 1986. With a budget of only $25 million, and released on November 26, 1986, Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home would rake in an impressive $133 million at the box office. That's about $313 million in today's money, beating both Star Trek II and III's numbers. And so it was once again clear that Star Trek simply wasn't done at the movies quite yet. With the Enterprise A sailing off screen at the end of Star Trek IV, with seemingly new technologies to boldly go where no one had gone before, the movie possibilities seemed bright and endless. Of course, though, it is at this time that Star Trek would change and grow once again, as a new kid on the block would show up to challenge the aging original crew, and after major problems were ironed out, would become one of the best Star Trek series ever created. And when we next return to this Star Trek historical overview, we'll take a look at the production of Season 1 of TNG, and its crazy trek to becoming a fan favorite. I hope to see you then. Thank you for watching today's episode of Backtrek. What do you think of Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home? Do you think it deserves all the hype it gets in relation to the Star Trek universe? Well, leave your comments in the section below, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, hitting that little bell icon so you won't miss a single video we release. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Michael Okuda for taking the time out of his busy schedule to answer my questions on Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. He is truly an amazing man. If you want to help the channel out from becoming an endangered species, then consider becoming a channel patron. The link to our Patreon account is in the description below. Thanks again for watching. Live long and prosper.